Wonderful. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for spending a part of your Thursday evening with us. My name is Mario Wahba, and I serve as a climate justice policy analyst at Citizens for Public Justice, or CPJ for short. We live and work in so-called Ottawa on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. We deeply honor the land, the peoples, and the history, and we take seriously the obligations that flow from that acknowledgement. And I invite you to acknowledge the Indigenous territory that you come from as well, or that you're speaking to us from. Few housekeeping notes or items. This session is being recorded, and all registrants will receive the link by email tomorrow or around that time. Please try to keep yourself muted at all time unless you're speaking. You can post questions in the chat at any time. We'll gather those questions and pose them to our panelists in the Q&A section, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But you can also ask questions using the raise hand function during the discussion portion as well, if you wish to speak live or out loud. So tonight we're exploring how Canada can build safe, fair pathways for people displaced by climate impacts, and we're doing that alongside the launch of CPJ's new report, Climate-induced Migration: Canada's Obligations and Opportunities. Allegra will drop the link to the digital report in the chat very shortly. And please do reach out if you would like some printed copies. We have those as well. And as I will mention, any donation makes you a member to Citizens for Public Justice, and that makes you eligible to have any of those reports for free as well. So we'll begin by introducing our very knowledgeable speakers. Dr. And Professor Kamel Zaidi is one of Canada's leading scholars on immigration law and policy. He is assistant professor of law at the University of Calgary, and his research focuses on immigration law, renewable energy, transportation, and related environmental and policy issues. So thank you again for being with us, Professor Zaidi. And Rachel Bryce. Rachel Bryce is the chair of the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers, Carl, and the Climate and Migration Working Group. She co-wrote the research, the 2021 and 2023 Carl Climate Migration Reports, surveying regional and domestic responses to climate migration and outlining both legal and policy responses for the Government of Canada to implement implement solutions. So thanks again for being with us, Rachel. Really an honor to have you. We're set aside well over 25 minutes at the end for a Q&A discussion, as we promised. Please drop your questions in the chat anytime. As I already mentioned, we'll stack them. You can also raise your hand to speak near the end. So, Allegra, if you can begin the presentation, that would be great. And I will try, I promise you, to keep it as short as possible so that you can hear from our speakers, our panelists. And I know you all didn't sign up for a presentation from two lawyers and a lawyer to be, but I promise we'll try and keep it fun and light and not too much into the details. So yeah, let me know whenever you're ready, Allegra, with the presentation.
Sure, I'm just pulling it up.
Perfect. Thank you. I can already start by introducing myself a little bit deeply. I've been working as a climate justice policy analyst with Citizens for Public Justice for over 3 years, almost 4 years now. And Citizens for Public Justice is based here in Ottawa, a few blocks away from Parliament Hill, which enables us to be in direct relationship with decision makers on Parliament Hill. And as we'll get to know, Citizens for Public Justice is a faith-based organization that does advocacy and public engagement on three main policy areas: refugee and migrant rights, climate justice, and poverty eradication. And so I'm personally proud of the fact that CPJ is not a single issue organization. And today is a testament of that because we're looking at two of those areas, being climate justice and refugee and migrant rights, from that intersectional overlapping lens. So yeah, I hope you can all see the presentation. If we can go into presenter view down there, that would be great. Thank you, Allegra. And yeah, we'll begin. Maybe the first slide. Um, I don't need to tell you all what is already probably old news, but yeah, if we can move on to the next slide. Yeah, so as I mentioned, Citizens for Public Justice employs a rights-based, intersectional, anti-oppressive approach to our advocacy and policy. Next slide, please. So I don't need to tell you what is already probably old news for you all. Over the past decade, climate-related disasters displaced over 220 million people, about 60,000 people per day. So we don't usually put it at that number in terms of daily statistic, but 60,000 people around the world per day. Recent snapshot in Pakistan, you have the 2022 floods that displaced 7.9 million people in Somalia. 2023 droughts displaced 3.8 million people. And even here in Canada, in 2023, the wildfires displayed over 200,000 people. And the UNHCR already warns that countries facing extreme climate hazards could jump from 3 countries on average per year to 65 countries. Just as a reference, the members of the United Nations are 193. Next slide, please. And marginalized communities are often on the front line. So risk isn't just weather, it's exposure plus vulnerability. It's the combination of those two elements. So people in poverty, those in precarious housing and infrastructure, those with precarious status, immigration status, as we'll get to here, indigenous peoples, seniors, children, persons with disability, members of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. Those are hit the hardest, and especially women. Women are facing heightened gender-based violence risk during and after displacement, and climate change weakens already stretched protection systems, those at least that do exist for women in vulnerable places. Next slide, please. And Canada has no dedicated legal pathways, as again we'll get to hear in much greater depth, for people displaced by climate impacts. Our Immigration Refugee Protection Act, which is a framework that regulates the admission of refugees and migrants in Canada, tracks or follows the 1951 Refugee Convention, which does not recognize climate displacement. We have responded in ad hoc responses before in Haiti in 2010 or Nepal in 2015, but case by case isn't a policy. And we have to remember that we have to have comprehensive and consistent measures to address those human rights crises. Next slide, please. Under the ICCPR, um, states must protect life and avoid returning people to life-threatening conditions, which is the principle of non-refoulement. So the ICCPR is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So Article 6 protects the right to life, and Article 7 protects is the right to non-refoulement, which is again the right to not send, avoid returning people to life-threatening conditions. The Global Compact on Migration calls for humanitarian consideration for sudden onset disasters and cooperation on slow onset climate harms. And so these are objectives 5J and 5H. Again, 5J is the one on sudden onset disasters, and 5H is the one on slow onset climate harms. And then there's this case from uh, New Zealand, because I would be remiss again, was at least two confirmed lawyers on the call and one lawyer to be, not to bring up precedent. And so I probably should have trained myself on how to pronounce that style of cause. But this case, precedent that climate threats can trigger the threat of non-refoulement duties. So it is a valid reason not to deport someone if you find that they are under threat of climate-induced disasters or extreme weather events. Next slide, please. Um, so what is Canada's responsibility in all of this? And where does fairness and international responsibility play in? And the short answer is Canada is hugely responsible for historical emission. Canada is among the top 10 emitters, second highest per capita, again, about 17 per 0.7 tons of CO2 emissions per person, roughly 3 times the global rate. That's similar to driving around the world twice a year. Uh, and under the Paris Agreement uh, and under principles in international climate negotiations, like the responsibility and responsibility, I have that right here. Yeah, the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. Now you know why I was struggling with it. Under that principle, Canada that shaped obligations on mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. So Canada does have both a moral and legal obligation to provide funding for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Next slide, please. Um, so we have clear challenges in the system that I'm not going to, again, go too much into. But for instance, there is the fear of overburdening the already existing asylum system, and we all know that the existing asylum system does not function perfectly. So there's fear that if you quote unquote open the floodgates to climate migrants, that would further compromise that system. There's also concern for diluting the protections from the 1951 Refugee Convention. And again, that's a similar concern where UNHCR refugees are not already getting the resettlement that they deserve and need fast enough, let alone climate refugees. And of course, politically, there is a rising nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment that shapes then the political backlash. But what can we do on the hopeful side? Next slide, please. The other countries are providing positive role models. So, for instance, New Zealand offers small but a permanent residency stream for Pacific Islanders whose islands may be at risk of disappearing under rising seawater. Argentina provides 3-year humanitarian visa that is linked to environmental disasters, and just the structural certainty of that to be able to know that this program already exists is a huge advantage. And Germany debated a climate passport, and it didn't pass, but it is treated as a serious policy idea, and you can imagine something similar to that, whether again similar to the UNHCR refugees passport or travel document, or similar to an international or local climate passport being something within the realm of possibilities. Next slide, please. So investing early, what we know from climate science is that investing early pays off. Proactive adaptation and proactive adaptation investments can return from 13 to 15 dollars, depending on the time span for every dollar spent. But reactive responses are costlier and so confusion. And we know that the result of that confusion is lack of safety for many refugees and migrants. So next slide, please. We'll go for recommendations. So one, create a clear humanitarian pathway for environmental migrants. Two, use temporary protection for sudden onset disasters and then implement pilot resettlement for slow onset cases like sea level rises. And three, resource gender-based responsive disability inclusive settlement supports, which are housing health, livelihoods, and mental health. And finally, pair this with strong domestic decarbonization and fair climate finance program. Just to come back to what Citizens for Public Justice is doing. So this is one aspect of our work on climate justice in collaboration with the refugee and migrant rights portfolio. Next slide, please. But we have a few other initiatives. The Jubilee is 2025, which is the Turn It into Hope initiative. It is an international debt cancellation campaign based on a biblical tradition in the at least still ongoing in the Catholic Church of forgiving debts, and we're asking for at least in the year 2000, which is the last year we had a jubilee year. We managed to cancel 130 million dollars in debt for the poorest 37 countries in the world, and sorry, 137 billion dollars. Let me correct that. That is a very important distinction for the poorest 37 countries, and we collected 100,000 signatures here in Canada. So we're aiming to replicate that success. We also just filed a lawsuit against the government of Saskatchewan. Believe me, I didn't have anything to do with it. I'm still too young to practice, but we wanted to stop them from using coal in energy generation or electricity generation, to be exact, potentially up to 2050. And hopefully we'll be successful in that. Our next hearing is in November, so please follow us to stay in touch. And we have our annual campaigns like Give It Up for the Earth, which is our Lenten campaign. And you can participate as well by signing up to our newsletter. And next slide, please. With that groundwork, again, I'd like to invite you to sign up to our monthly newsletter. It is only once a month, 12 emails a year, so you will not be inundated, and you'll see a breadth of all of this wonderful and exciting things that we do. And you can partner with us in research also if you are in academia. So please get in touch, and please donate. As I will mention at the end, your financial contribution makes you a member for an entire year, no matter the size of your contribution. And it enables us to do cool work like this and to represent your voice in front of federal politicians here in Ottawa. With that in mind, let's learn from the experts shaping the legal and policy architecture in Canada. And I'll hand it off to Professor Zaidi.
Thank you very much. Welcome to everyone. I thank all the guests for showing up today, and of course, for CPJ for hosting such an event. Thank you very much for attending, all of you. I hope you find my presentation short, concise, and yet meaningful. Can everyone see my slides? Okay. So with respect to my background, I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I am in the law faculty at the University of Calgary. This is my third year of teaching, and I've practiced for 15 years in my life before, which is why I look like this now. And so I've covered many different fields of practice, one of which was immigration. And as I researched over the years with renewable energy and energy and environmental law, first of all, I wanted to make a correction. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a PhD. I have a master's only. So while I look like a PhD, I'm not. And I just wanted to clarify that point first. Secondly, I had a lot of experience in terms of researching and publication over the years. And I came across climate change and climate migration as an area of study because I've taught energy courses, but I've also, I'm involved with immigration law as well. And last year, the motivation for me studying this particular topic had to do with intersecting both areas. It's amazing what you learn in your life and you kind of integrate knowledge accordingly. Climate migration was something that was an idea I came up with last year. And this year I was able to formulate a thesis in which I'm including Canada's role in climate migration. Now, with respect to the the types of immigration that occur all over the world, Canada, of course, is a very popular nation for migrants from all categories. But if you look at from a comparative perspective, in mid-2024, there are many countries that play an enormous role in receiving migrants in different categories. This kind of gives you an idea of Canada's reception of about 8.8 million migrants from mid-2024. This, of course, can be broken down into different categories, but you can see the US, the UK, Germany, and Saudi Arabia included. These are some of the big nations in the world that are hosting migrants, and quite a few to that measure. When you look at the role that immigration plays in our economies and just in dealing with demographics, we have very low reproductive rates in Western nations, which is why immigration is one of the major policies in our countries. And so it's very easy to dismiss, as was mentioned before by Mario, that there is an anti-immigrant trend or sentiment. That's always going to be the case in any country you go to. I've lived in Pakistan, and there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment against Afghanis. Okay, so you're going to find that in every country. That's not unusual, but it's something worth discussing. And with respect to my research, my current research in climate migration, this is something that I'm outlining for you, the table of contents of my own paper, which is not published yet, but I'm hoping for it one day. It will be. So when you look at the different questions I'm asking here in my table of contents, I start off with the definition of climate migration. I get into some of the trends of climate migration, which include rural to urban migration and cross-border migration. Then I get into the international and comparative law of how the international community and specific jurisdictions have been treating climate change in order for Canada to possibly incorporate such a framework in its own country. And so when we're dealing with some of the research findings that I came across, I'm a comparative lawyer, so I deal with comparisons made in other jurisdictions, and I discuss the advantages and disadvantages of how Canada can benefit from that. It's what we in the law call persuasive authority. So we're dealing with different nations like New Zealand, Australia, and some of the small island developing states, as Mario mentioned before. And when we're dealing with the issues of the causes of migration, normally we think about quality of life, rule of law, and seeking employment opportunities and family reunification. There's all kinds of objectives of our immigration policies in Canada, but what's left out from this prominently is the issue of climate migration. Even though we actually experience a lot of that climate migration in Canada, and that will be discussed further. But basically, what I have found in my own limited research is that there is a lot of opportunities to learn from international developments, from the United Nations, and also from specific jurisdictions. And what's important to know is that climate migration is something that consists of internal displacement and external displacement, where you have people moving temporarily from their home to another place because they're escaping some kind of effect of climate change, whether it's drought, whether it's lack of water resources, whether it's inclement weather, whatever the case may be. You will see migration in general being tackled from a policy perspective, where we anticipate people moving for various reasons, but what is the role of environmental effects from climate change in that migration? And that's something that when you are looking at the world in terms of its responses to climate change, it does impact their local policies. When we look at various areas of law, environmental, property, agriculture, you name it, and of course immigration, this has not really been treated in the academic literature, other than the fact that there have been major developments on the international stage. As I mentioned here, these are just some findings from my own research, is that we're dealing with drought, desertification, wildfires. We have plenty of wildfires in Canada every summer. And if you don't believe in climate migration, well, there's one of your proof of climate migration, climate change in general, I should say. Heat waves, which affect the whole world, soil erosion, crop failures, deforestation, and of course, rising sea levels, which affect individual nations, including the island nations. The question is, though, how does that impact immigration? How does that translate to people moving from one country to another? That's known as external displacement. And so while it's true that climate migration deals with mostly internal displacement, you have also external displacement, where people voluntarily choose to leave their countries. And as Mario mentioned before, you end up with asylum cases and other pathways of immigration to countries like Canada as a direct result of environmental effects. Not so much with persecution, which is something we find in the Convention refugee definition from the 1951 Convention Refugee Conference. And so when you're dealing with convention refugees, often it is a source of problem from persecution, political, religious, social. And in these enumerated characteristics that we see in our equality rights provisions under Section 15 of the Charter of Rights, you'll see a lot of applications from other countries as a result of the politics and the social disorder. But the question is, what happens when people move because of the effect of climate change? And the Tetiota case, as was mentioned before by Mario, is a very unique case because it actually deals directly with climate migration, climate change, and immigration. Excuse me. And so that's when you're dealing with this issue of, is persecution the only factor that we look at? Okay, we have different types of climate migration that are featured prominently in certain jurisdictions, particularly in island nations. Now, there is renewable energy in island nations, but there's also this issue of the use of land. Land use is a big feature of property law. And the question is, if you're dealing with a loss of land, a loss of crop yield potential, a loss of food, a loss of jobs, and a loss of living standards and livelihoods, how can you survive in such an environment? That has actually led to, in terms of climate change effects, it has led to a lot of migration with respect to only these issues, and not so much with political persecution. But in the trend from the rural communities to the urban communities, you have this situation where people are forced to move because environmental effects do impact economics. It impacts livelihoods of individuals. And so you have people who are forced to move from small island developing states, or SIDS as we say, and they're moving to countries like New Zealand and Australia. They're actually developing legal frameworks known as the Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility. When you're dealing with countries like Australia, which is very similar to Canada in terms of being a common law jurisdiction, in terms of population, of course, Australia, excuse me, is unique in its own way, and they have better cricket players as well. But the idea with Australia is that you're dealing with bilateral treaties with nations like Tuvalu, and they're creating separate immigration categories for climate migration, which is very interesting because this is a common law country that's doing it. And there's a possibility that Canada can follow suit as a similar common law country. But it's up to Canada to decide to do that. When you look at all the international law developments from 1951, which was the last time I had breakfast, to today's world, and all the declarations and all the legal frameworks that have developed between countries in particular parts of the world, all the way up to the signing of the Paris Agreement, you can imagine and appreciate that such regional frameworks can lead to further discussion in countries like Canada that lacks this kind of framework. And it's surprising because we actually have climate migration issues. And so when you're looking at Canada's role in all of this, and we're understanding the development of climate migration as a serious topic of discussion, what can be done by, say, Parliament? What can be done by the individual provincial legislatures? How can climate migration fit into immigration legislation like ERPA? Excuse me. Or how can we develop policies which are essentially the philosophy of government, the values of government in that particular society? How can we, in addition to persecution, add climate migration to such a framework? So with respect to what's at stake, a great deal is at stake because the future of immigration is going to depend a lot on issues like climate change. There's an intersection there, but we're not paying attention to it. And I think we need to pay more attention to it because of future planning. If there's one thing that governments are very poor at, it's future planning. They are mostly knee-jerk reactive about what's happening in today's world. The question is what's going to happen 5 years from now when there are more climate migrants coming to Canada. Should we amend our legislation? Can we modernize Canadian immigration law? How can we actually find a way of integrating migration with climate change? When we are a supporter of Paris Agreement and Canada's role as a nation with respect to reducing carbon emissions and playing an active role in becoming a green, sustainable nation, why are we not applying that to immigration? When one of the causes of migration, which is becoming more and more apparent, is when you see countries dealing with climate migration issues, they are receiving migrants because of environmental effects. And those same migrants are coming to Canada. But we're missing that from the equation. My final point is that I think there's a great opportunity for Canada to include climate migration as part of its policy, in addition to persecution from international sources, but strengthening the domestic. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Wow. Thank you, Professor Davey. That was wonderful. Again, really appreciate all of the insights and the knowledge and the nuances. I know that took me back to some of my law classes. But yes, I'll welcome any questions right away if people have fresh questions or thoughts. But if not, that's totally fine. We can also proceed with the program. I'll allow for the customary awkward silence that lets the good ideas flow.
You know, when you give a presentation, you start coughing for no reason. Just bad timing.
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
So for my law class that I'm taking, we were supposed to do a policy proposal. So my policy proposal is like integrating climate migrants into the Immigration and Refugee Act. And my question is, sorry, I wrote it down somewhere. What research methods would be needed to integrate like climate migrants into the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act?
That's a very good question. The number one answer I'll give you is comparative law, which is what I'm doing. And now it's easy for me to say that because I do it. I learned in law school a long time ago that comparative law is one of the most effective methods of research. That's the research methodology. And it's very difficult to debate someone when they have found answers in other countries on what to do with a particular issue. It gives you a sense of comparison. It also gives you a sense that it's of universal application, that there's a possibility that Canada can use climate migration strategies or policies adopted by other common law countries or even civil law countries. They don't have to be common law. The idea with comparative law is that it gives you numbers, statistics. What I didn't discuss is migration data. We need more of that to understand the sources of migration so that we can plan policy and receive migrants in a fair and equitable fashion. Okay. So that's one of the things. Administrative law in general is another area of research that you can pursue in terms of understanding how governments work. agencies, particularly immigration agencies, like the IRCC in Canada, which used to be CIC. So when you're dealing with administrative law cases, I teach administrative law here at the university, and we talk about government agency decisions in immigration all the time. It's not exclusively immigration, but you're dealing with government agencies. How do they deal with applications? Why do they reject certain applicants? How do they face appeals? And what happens when somebody goes for judicial review and has used the agency's own processes and decides to go to a court? That's called judicial review. And they might overturn the agency's decision. That's the only power that can do that. So notwithstanding what's happening in our world with, certain political leaders making decisions like they're a judge, they don't have judicial powers. They don't understand this point. And so administrative law, comparative law are very good research methodologies. They're certainly not the only ones. I'm sure Rachel can weigh in with her findings and suggestions as well. But I'm a biased individual. I love comparative law. So that's the answer I can give you.
Thank you.
Perfect. And that's a bit of a sneak peek into the discussion for later on. But thanks again for this in-depth look at how Canadian law can evolve to meet this moment. And without further ado, Rachel Bryce will follow with insights from Carl's climate migration work and concrete policy levers that Canada can deploy. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Okay. Let me get this up and going. So, to avoid a repetition, I'll sort of go through my slides more as a guide of the topics that we've already discussed, and I'll dive deeper into the sections that have yet to be, I think, explored, hopefully opening the door to the audience for any questions that will come up. That I think in this area, which is sort of the meeting of two quite controversial topics in our public realm, I think breeds interesting discussion. So I'm curious what people will have to say. I first want to acknowledge that although I'm currently in London, UK, I am from Toronto, Ontario, which is on the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, among many other nations. I think it's important to have this land acknowledgement in this conversation in particular because we are talking about the environment and an understanding of mobility, both within a country and across borders. We can learn a lot from the Indigenous peoples of Canada and the Indigenous peoples across the globe, and I think it's an important framework for our topic today. So just as a sort of initial overview, I think there's important context to talk about when we're talking about environmental mobility that I'll go through. I'll talk a little bit more about the legal foundation that Professor Zaidi very effectively introduced to us, go over current pathways, both at the domestic, the regional, and the international level, concerns that I think we all are probably exposed to, if not feeling ourselves, and then I'll dig further into the proposed pathways that the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers put forward in our two reports from 2021 and 2023. And I hope to leave with a couple action items as well and, call everyone on this seminar into a little bit more of a positive spirit, because this can be quite a heavy topic. So to talk more about this context, the numbers are large and the estimates have been in the millions, but I like to shift the conversation not to numbers, but to people and the human impacts. And I think we've already had that in this conversation today, but I want to reemphasize that because when we're talking about environmental hazards and human mobility, I think it can kind of get lost in the statistics that these are real human lives that are being displaced and interrupted. And, there is, of course, a human rights obligation, I think, behind state action. But, more importantly, I think it calls us as human beings to think about the structures that govern us and how we want to be part of a change in our global system to honor and respect the lives of these people who are impacted. So, as Professor Zaidi summarized, the environmental hazards that we're talking about, whether that's climate change effects, whether that's side effects of pollution and overconsumption, whether that's natural disasters that are worsening because of climate change, all of that leads to displacement from shelter, unhoused populations, loss of livelihood, especially in regions where the livelihood is rooted in the earth and in the environment around you. But we're talking about agriculture, fishing, all of these, fundamental livelihoods for a lot of rural communities, where that's all of their economy is disrupted because of these disasters. And of course, that then impacts access to food and clean drinking water. So I want to sort of have that as our foundation as we're going through this conversation, that we're talking about real people, and we're talking about, the role law can play and policy can play in aiding and protecting those people. The other thing I want to sort of put forward at the outset, and this is a new movement, I think, in the academic and policy arenas, is understanding climate change not as a driver of migration, but rather an amplifier to existing patterns. So climate change both amplifies in other environmental disasters, and it amplifies the social and political tensions that might exist in a region. And all of that together is what might push someone to leave their home, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, or with the aid of government through planned relocation. Another important note at this point is that not only is a majority of displacement internal to countries at this point, because I think we can all understand that people with homes and families and communities might not want to leave their countries, or they might not be able to. Another side conversation that is burgeoning is this conversation around immobile populations that, due to the amplification that climate change has, are not able to leave their homes, their residences, but life is still impacted negatively because of climate change or environmental hazards. Part of our conversation around policy needs to take those populations into consideration as well. So, not to belabor the legal side of this, but there are many intersecting areas of law, as Professor Zaidi introduced, that govern a state's responsibility to protect individuals who are impacted from environmental hazards. Many international human rights legislations, including the ICCPR, the ICSCR, and the CRC, for example, Convention on the Rights of the Child is the last one there. Many of these other conventions that are sort of hard treaty law in the international space govern the rights of individuals who have maybe unique, for ICCPR and ICSCR, that's all people. That's the rights of all people, in particular for Article 6, the right to life. CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention on the Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. Those particular conventions are tied to marginalized populations like children, women. They're conventions for people with disabilities. All of these extra marginalizations will have a home under international human rights law to seek protection from the states that are governing and protecting over them. An interesting movement in the academic world is looking to other areas of international law to apply to this context. So the right to a healthy environment has been recently recognized at the International Court of Justice through the advisory opinion that came out just in this past July. If anyone's interested, I highly recommend reading this decision, not just for the climate mobility conversation, because frankly, it doesn't have that much to say because it wasn't a direct question asked of the court. But this decision really does dive into states' responsibilities within the context of climate change. And that has to do with adaptation, mitigation, a whole realm of international responsibilities that states may or may not have. There's another decision I will plug as well. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights has almost a more fulsome decision, which was 2 states asked them to make this reference with regards to the impacts of climate change. And they had, different than the International Court of Justice, a much more open call for testimony from civil society, from organizations across the globe, to answer these questions about what do states have to do in response to the impacts of climate change. Because of this open call for testimony, they received, I think it was something like 360 submissions from different groups, which in the law is a lot. And that led the decision to be really rooted in the human and the people impacted, which led to more powerful language around human mobility and the role to protect people who are displaced because of climate change. So those 2 decisions I think are really interesting to look at. Then, as was already discussed, we can look to refugee law in some cases. That is, as Professor Zaidi introduced, limited because it is under the 1951 Convention and 1967 Protocol. It is restricted to the 5 grounds of, inalienable grounds for persecution. It is tied to an agent of persecution. That means either the state or a non-state actor. And it is personalized. All of these things mean that climate is kind of not able to fit into any of those boxes. But here's where I think the understanding of climate as an amplifier can help us sort of apply refugee law as is appropriate. So climate change amplifies the risks already on the ground, might destabilize a region, which might then lead to a group that is marginalized or a minority group, environmental protesters, any of these groups might be then persecuted after an environmental hazard occurs. They will then have a right to claim asylum if they cross a border, and they can get protection based on the ground of their particular group. That is not going to be for every person displaced from the environment, but it is a pathway. And then I think other conversations around what international law in the broader sense can help us, push our states forward are these soft law agreements like the global compacts that were referenced earlier, which were state commitments to create pathways for legal protection for environmentally displaced people. And under the Paris Agreement, the Loss and Damage Fund, which is a call to action with regards to financial investment to put money into this fund, which many states have agreed to do. It's just not coming nearly as quickly or to nearly the extent we need. And that money would in part go towards adaptation efforts and the conception of adaptation, which, if you don't know, means basically instead of trying to prevent the effects of climate change, we recognize the effects of climate change are already happening. Here's money that we're going to put into these communities to try to make them more resilient. Part of adaptation funds also may go to folks who are displaced because of environmental hazards. I'll touch on the Canadian side of things as I talk about proposed pathways. So I'm going to move forward here to briefly chat about a couple areas of current law that we haven't yet to talk about. So yes, there are good examples of domestic solutions that are being put forward. You'll see I put US and Canada on that temporary protection list. That's really just for very short, ad hoc, sudden onset responses to disasters. So for Canada, that is a temporary public policy for after an earthquake in Haiti, after the tsunami in India. These sort of very short, time-limited protection pathways have been successful, but are so limited just to, natural disasters. In the US, they have temporary protective status, TPS, and that's more of a bilateral agreement with certain states that they can choose and sort of present as responding to environmental hazards as well. That provides protected status to allow people from certain countries that might be impacted from the environment to remain within the United States. All of those to me are just not satisfactory. They are part of the toolkit, but I think we need to start thinking bigger. Part of thinking bigger are the bilateral agreements that Professor Saidi was very apt to point out, the Philippili Accord between Tuvalu and Australia, and the Kiwi Pacific Access Visa, which is not climate specific, but allows for labor mobility between many small island developing states and New Zealand. These are more and more common, and I think we're going to probably see more and more of these because of the potential friction in international spaces. Bilateral agreements will be one part of the solution to creating two countries, or a group of countries will come together and say, I'm impacted from climate change, my people need a home, at least temporarily. I am a wealthy nation with decreasing demographics. I can create some pathways for you. That's, I think, one political, policy-based legal protection pathway forward. What I want to sort of put some focus in, and here's my bias because I'm writing a doctoral thesis on free movement agreements. But I think regional agreements are another interesting angle in the international space. You look to, the Horn of Africa, you look to Western Africa, you look to Latin America, the Caribbean, in the Pacific. All of these regions have different agreements between the member states to allow mobility between their states in some capacity, whether that's for labor, whether that's, for temporary visiting rights. Usually it's short term. There are many limitations, but the IGAD Free Movement Protocol, which I've highlighted here, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is in the Horn of Africa or East Africa, that is an interesting example of a free movement agreement that specifically identifies climate change and environmental hazards as a force for displacement in their region. With that acknowledgement, I'm curious, and I think my hypothesis is that we hopefully will have more take-up in the region, more recognition of climate as this driver, and a potential lightening of the burden on folks that are displaced because they can travel to a neighboring country without having to jump through many bureaucratic loophole barriers and hurdles and whatnot. Something I think could have a whole presentation on its own, but I wanted to flag that now. Here's where I think I want to engage with the audience and hear what people have to say, because I don't have the answers to a lot of these concerns. With rising nationalism, we're seeing a fortification of borders. We're seeing closing down of immigration programs rather than an opening up of immigration programs. We're seeing rising anti-immigrant sentiment when I think the reality is it's about the hoarding of wealth rather than, the people who are just trying to seek a better life. that's a big concern of mine. How do we create these policies in an international space when the international space is disintegrating in front of us? I do have hope, but it's a very real concern. Something, again, that I mentioned at the top is this right to remain for folks that are in climate vulnerable regions but don't wish to leave. How do you properly invest in both adaptation on the ground for communities that want to stay where they are and programs that respect the right of people to leave or protect people who have to leave? As I flagged, many of the solutions have been temporary. We really need to focus on creating policy and law for permanent solutions. That doesn't have to mean every person who's displaced from the environmental hazards has to permanently move somewhere else. That just means they need to have an option to. And that can be through many different programs. And one final note, another one that I think is worth digging into in questions is that of statelessness. What happens when a small island state disappears? How do we identify, that person's right as that citizen of that country? And there are some solutions to this already. The Falapili Agreement isn't one that has rooted cultural identity within the agreement and really tries to center the existence of Tuvalu as, inherent, even if the state itself disappears. Very interesting. The International Court of Justice talks about this, but it then again, I think, raises our conversation around Indigenous culture and Indigenous wisdom that we can come back to understand how to protect those cultural rights. Okay, so for Canada, the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers puts forward a toolkit of sorts of various legal and policy proposals for our country to, take a leadership role and make some significant changes to address this population that may not have a clear path forward. Side note, many migrants and refugees don't identify environment as a reason they're on the move. That's another concern that I think could be remedied by creating pathways for people to say, hey, yeah, I lost my farm. I guess it was because of the hurricane, and I never had ability to, reformulate my livelihood. You can start putting those pieces together once there's a legal pathway for you. The legal proposition we put forward is an amendment to Section 97 of the Immigration Refugee Protection Act. This is basically subsidiary protection akin to refugee protection, but does not require that you fit under one of the 5 refugee grounds. Instead, we propose putting in a human rights-based protection tied to a specific definition of a climate migrant who has been displaced, crossed a border, and faces a risk to their life under ICCPR-based language. There is already a subsection under Section 97 that has this language, but it's more general for risks of cruel and unusual treatment and harm. We just propose adding another with the climate migrant definition attached to that. And legal amendments are difficult, and so we suggest at the same time as efforts to add this amendment, there should be policy solutions put forward, which could be done through the humanitarian and compassionate grounds under Section 25 of the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, which allows the minister discretion to grant permanent residency or grant an exception to an immigration rule where there are humanitarian and compassionate grounds to justify this. What Carl is proposing is that the minister create specific guidelines that identify climate and environmental hazards as a constituent part of that conversation around humanitarian and compassionate grounds. And then there are, I think, broader temporary public policies that could be put in place that aren't just ad hoc, sudden onset temporary public policies. We could look to creating circular migration pathways with states that are impacted from, worse and worse dry seasons where their environment in their home country is not viable for half of the year. We can create circular migration pathways that respect their rights to go there and back, but also protect them here in Canada when they are here, because I think some of us might know the temporary foreign worker program is unfortunately rife with issues, and we need to ensure that people are safe when they're working in Canada and not taken advantage of. And then I think I already talked about the importance of investing in loss and damage. That's the international commitment under the Paris Agreement. The support for regional agreements, which means support both politically and financially. One interesting suggestion, and I would recommend people who are interested look at the World Refugee Migration Council. They put forward a 3-prong proposition. One, and their third prong, which is sort of the longer term thought. First prong is this domestic solutions. Second prong is political solutions, including regional agreements. And this third prong is potentially creating new international law through a protocol to the Convention on Statelessness, which would hopefully, in the ideal world, create protections at an international scale that would act as new treaty law and impose the states who sign on to obligations to protect folks that are displaced because of environmental hazards that might link to statelessness. Okay, so a lot of information. I put some names of places that I respect on the board. Bias again, because I am currently at the Refugee Law Initiative and the work they do is really cool and great. But I would also recommend speaking to your members of parliament about this issue. There are very tangible ways that the parliament can propose policy solutions to create pathways today. The Minister of Immigration could write a declaration right now and put forward some of these policy suggestions. Look to local organizations, both in Canada and in climate vulnerable regions, and help newcomers integrate, because we're not talking just about environmental hazards in their home country, but trying to integrate into a changing climate in Canada as well. Especially when we're talking about foreign workers who are on the farms in the heat. So I think that's everything. Feel free to take my email down and send me more emails, but I would love to hear what everyone has to say.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for this great and comprehensive and informative overview. I really appreciate it. And for those compassionate reminders that it's all about the humans, like that we might get caught up in the statistics or the concepts, but it's all about the people that if they were in a different position, they would have fought for themselves, but because they're not, they have to do this work. So yeah, I want to open it up. Please, again, if you are shy, add your question to the chat. If you want, you can also just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question live. And we have a good amount of time for the number of people that we have. So yeah. Any thoughts?
Well, I agree with Mario when I heard you say that you were going to move from the statistics to the people part. I decided I was going to really listen to you. And I liked what I heard. That's just briefly, but that really impressed me because I have a real allergy to statistics. So I try to avoid them, but you can't always.
No, it's an important part of the conversation as well, right? Because I think, especially talking to parliamentarians, they want to understand what the scale of the issue is. And I think that the problem with talking about scale is that you we don't want to scare people by saying, look at these millions of people who will be displaced. Because in reality, it won't all come to Canada's door. But I think, if we root it in the conversation around human impact, it's a good place to start.
Mm-hmm. Good. And then you can move to the statistic.
Exactly.
People come first.
Yeah.
Well, they should come first. They don't always.
Yeah, exactly.
You get caught up in a lot of red tape and reasons why we shouldn't have so many people coming to our country.
Yeah, it's a shame, right? When you have anti-immigrant sentiment that sort of is clouded by people creating false narratives and misunderstanding Canada's need and most Western nations' need for immigration.
I'm happy to say that I'm in touch with. I'm from Nova Scotia, but I keep in touch with a farm, a group of people called the Spur Brothers who rely on migrant workers to, and the way that they treat them in the community and have trained the community to treat their migrant workers is just phenomenal and so beautiful that it's a good example for all people who are connected with migrant workers.
No, that's amazing to hear. That actually reminds me, Florence, I wanted to add something to the tail end. I am conducting new research with the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers centered on migrants and newcomers in Canada and how environment may or may not have influenced their decisions to leave or their journeys. If Florence, you want to send me an email, I would love to get in touch with this friend and see if he would be willing or they would be willing to speak to me.
She's the manager of the farm.
Yeah, that would be great. I would love to maybe speak to the foreign workers if they're willing to.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Florence. And Charlene?
Yes, I think, Rachel, you were asking for maybe some feedback about how Canadians feel about people who are coming to Canada or have come. I think we're like a dichotomy. We have kind of two ways. I mean, if we go to the Tim Hortons, or like me, if I go to be with my mom who lives in long-term care, and all her caregivers are people who have come to Canada fairly recently, then we see the absolute necessity of having people come to Canada to help out in our country. And then on the other hand, we hear, there's too many people have come. There's not enough place for them to live. They're making too much difficulty with being too many young people in the schoolrooms and all this feedback. And I think there was the time when we did have a lot of people come to study in colleges, particularly in Ontario, where the Ontario colleges opened up to have so many students come because they needed those students to help to pay the tuition because Ontario cut back so severely on what they were granting to colleges. So anyways, all to say that our immigration system in Canada is really quite complex. Absolutely. And particularly then when you also start to talk about the temporary foreign workers that Florence has been speaking about, the ones who come to work on the farms, and there would be very good situations like Florence's farm friends, and there would be other situations where the people are having, they don't have a car to be able to go to the grocery store for themselves. They're kind of caught and they have to stay just with that one employer. So it's the way the system is set up, it's rife for abuse. Anyways, that's the things that I would, when you're asking for feedback from Canadians. And
No, I appreciate it.
it's
Thank
very much.
It's a complicated
Yes.
setting, right? We live in a time where I think there's this understanding, or in my mind, maybe misunderstanding of scarcity. And, when we have pressures of cost of living and housing and just trying to get by, it's a very human instinct to not want to share. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think there's a lot more resources. There are a lot more resources out there than, Canadians might realize. And it doesn't have to be a more for me, less for thee situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for that, Geraldine, as well. And Mark?
Yeah, it's a really complicated area. I mean, I've been trying to figure. I'm not a lawyer. I have no background in law, but I do work for, as a sponsorship agreement holder rep, and so I have a lot of contact with refugees. And I've also been following climate science for the last 30 years, 40 years. I don't know.
You are the expert, Mark.
Well, no, there isn't an expert. I think it's the, and so I see complications, inevitably. So, I mean, I see complications really around the definitions. How do we identify somebody as being a climate migrant or a climate refugee? And I mean, there are people who will say, no, you just can't do that. That's not a concept that has any meaning, because there's so many other factors involved. On the other hand, it's impacting people, and it's impacting people in horrendous ways. But I'm kind of wondering how you would get to a definition that would at least enable us to bring some people.
Yeah.
Through.
Yeah, I know. Great question. Sorry, go on.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, just thinking in terms of, there's two levels of attribution you need to do. You need to do the weather attribution piece, which is improving, but which is still really difficult with slow onset impacts, which are the ones that are going to produce the most refugees. But then you have to actually do the next piece of attribution, which is sort of, did these people move because of the climate impact, or did they move because of something else? And I mean, to my mind, that probably doesn't matter, but in law, probably it does.
Yeah, well, I think, Mark, you're kind of hitting the nail on the head, that there is this sort of tension around definitions. But I think your last point is maybe the most apt, that, regardless of the decision to move, if there are climate impacts that would adversely harm a person should they return to their home, that is sufficient under international human rights law to say you warrant protection. So it isn't a question of decisions. It's not a question of intention in immigration law. It's a question of, are there these impacts? Is your home safe? If it is not, you should have access to pathways out of that situation if you so desire. There is a definition we put forward in the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers report for a climate migrant, more relevant to our proposed legal amendment, because there, as you point out, the law requires some level of definition. We do leave it quite broad, though. It's really just, you have been displaced, you've crossed a border, and if you returned, you would face this risk to your life, or face cruel, unusual, or degrading treatment. That, is a legal definition, but doesn't necessarily require that everyone fit under that definition. There should be, I think, a multitude of solutions to respond to all of the types of climate displacement, because as we've pointed out, it's not just people who are displaced, it's people who choose to leave because they don't really want to stay where they are because it's not as easy, or, you know, they have, they want to try to live in a country that is more like their original climate. There are people who are moved by their government through planned relocation. Sometimes that's not fully consensual, which is an issue, but and there are people who are, you know, maybe stuck in their areas and need a way out or need funding to support them. So you have a slew of different policy responses that really don't require a definition of who they are. It comes back to who you are as a human and your inherent rights as a human under international human rights law.
But that process seems to have slowed down in recent months. I'm in touch with a group supporting refugees coming to Canada. And right now, there's a family that's been displaced from one country to another country because it wasn't safe. And that country is threatening to send them back. And if they do go back, it could mean that they all die, right? Or killed. But our government is moving very slow on that. And
Yeah.
the people that I'm working with are very supportive in their sponsorship of them.
Yeah, I'm sure Mark has experienced this as a SAW as well, where, you know, as much as it is good we live in a country that recognizes the rights of refugees, we still live in a major bureaucracy, and one that is increasingly bogged down and unfortunately increasingly cut with budgets, which seem misallocated. And it makes it harder to process these applications efficiently, which leaves people in limbo.
Yeah.
But I will say, as a refugee claimant, you can't be deported. Or you know, something really went wrong if you were deported.
From your own country.
Once you make a claim of asylum, you have a, you know, they have an international responsibility to keep you in the country until your asylum claim is processed.
They are not in Canada. They're in another country between their home country and Canada, right?
I see. Different story then, and unfortunate.
Yeah, and even in Canada, right, we have sometimes the safe third country agreement, which is also a terrible exclusion to that general rule, where people, as we're seeing increasingly is the case in the United States, that they come, and not only because of the political instability in the United States, but also just because there are some grounds for asylum that are not acknowledged in the United States, like sexual abuse and domestic abuse also. These are not, if you're fleeing, say, from Latin America and seeking asylum in the United States as the first country that is safe for you in your condition, and the United States does not recognize grounds like sexual abuse or domestic abuse as valid grounds for seeking asylum. And then you come to Canada, which does, like, at least the positive part of the story is that it does, Canada does recognize those two as valid grounds for asylum. You will still be turned back because supposedly you landed first in the United States. But which is why we're working at Citizens for Public Justice against that as well. Willard, please.
I'm wondering whether or not, and this probably, is a far-fetched idea, but if we're having trouble with definitions, particularly around refugee, because it's such a confined or described, it's predetermined what qualifies as a refugee. What if we come up with some new terminology instead of trying to fit it into an existing definition? What if we create something? Because we are already kind of like climate migration. That's a new concept that we're trying to fit into an old definition. So would we have some success in creating a new category or a new definition? So that's the one question I have. And the other is just, I suppose we're like, I mean, and then I'll plead my ignorance here, but I don't think we have island states that have been completely consumed by rising sea levels yet, right? But once that happens, like how can anybody expect them to return if there is nothing to return to? And so hopefully we don't get to that very soon, right? But it's like there's got to be something that pushes that envelope, and it'll probably be that kind of disaster. But yeah. Any thoughts on possibility of creating new definitions?
Yeah, you raised two very good points. So there are people in the academic and policy worlds in climate mobility and environmental displacement that have proposed various international conventions that would be new legal agreements to create protections for climate displaced people. And in those conventions, there surely would be a definition of who is under that protective status. They don't seem to get much cred and grounding because, unfortunately, we are in a time of international destabilization. Our international order, at least at sort of what it used to be, is no longer, I think, open to creating these new treaties of international protection. But silver lining, I think we really have everything we need already. We have international human rights law. We have, all of these different bilateral and regional agreements between states that really don't require a specific definition for someone to prove why they are worthy of protection. They just have to say they are, their right to life is in danger. And if they can establish that, then they should be able to claim that they should not be deported. And regardless, what I think is interesting is some of the proposals I put forward will not necessarily require you have any climate-related movement. In free movement agreements, it's open borders for that region. If you go through the proper, mechanisms of, you have your visa, you can then, everyone in that region has a regional visa, you're allowed to cross, you can establish yourself as a worker, you can, pay and get housing, and you can contribute across a different border. And then once your visa is done, you either can return to your country of origin, or you can seek other pathways for status in that country. That second option is a little bit fuzzy when we're talking about free movement agreements, because not all of these countries have those pathways for longer term resettlement. But something like that doesn't necessarily require we create a new definition. But your point is taken, and many people are talking about, okay, what if we created something new? It just doesn't seem like the international world is ready for it, unfortunately. To your other point, I think there are 3 islands that have already submerged. I think they're part of other countries, but it very much raises concern around statelessness. And that's why one of the proposals for international protection is this protocol, which is sort of an addendum to the Convention on Statelessness. So there's a convention under international human rights law that recognizes the need to protect the rights of people who don't have a state, who, for whatever reason, are not recognized to belong to any state. There is a potential that some of these small island states might disappear and people might be deemed stateless. I think what is the movement we're seeing is a little bit more towards grandfathering in the idea that those states were states and those people will be of that state for immemorial. That's sort of the way people are talking about it in this space so far. But throwing a radical idea out there, I think it might change the way we think about countries and nation states. I think we're going to start seeing some disintegration of nation state concepts in decades' time, because what is a state if it doesn't exist?
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, a lot of thought-provoking stuff there. And I want to just give Professor Zaidi a final chance to leave us with some final words. The discussion is so intriguing that we are at time already, but yeah, Professor Zaidi.
Yes, thank you, Mario, and thank you to all for attending today's event. I'm very grateful for all of you to take time out of your day to listen to Rachel and myself. And Willard, I like your Blue Jays shirt. Go Jays, go! And it was a great, impressive win last night, which gives us hope, right? That the nice guys can win. So it's a question of, I would leave a final thought with all of you that what should a nation state like Canada, which has always been open to migrants, which has a strong history of immigration. Our country was built on immigration, much like the United States. How is it that we can educate Canadians about improving that very nasty trend of anti-immigration sentiment? A lot of it has to do with just general ignorance. A lot of it has to do with cultural attitudes that form on social media for no reason. And, again, I'll be the devil's advocate. I'll be the person on the other side and say that statistics are important because governments don't make decisions without them, number one. Number two, you can prove to someone like CPJ or Florence or any one of you, you can point to statistics and mathematics and say, this is what's happening, and that leads to policy decisions. As someone who practiced immigration for many years, we had to deal with quotas all the time. And Alberta, for example, will allow so many migrants in the permanent resident pathway for what's called provincial nominee programs. There's so many students that we can introduce. And yes, there are problems with every pathway system, but that should not lead to any kind of dangerous discussion with respect to creating some propaganda against migrants when they're so fundamental to our economy. You take away immigration today and watch what happens to Canada, especially Tim Hortons. So if you're getting your coffee or beer or whatever you're getting, food, a lot depends on, and Canadian business owners will tell you this, that we need migrants. So where is this other attitude coming from? It's mainly because they're not aware of the statistics. And when you show them that, they kind of simmer down and they might come up with another excuse. But like Florence, what you were talking about was very important. Smaller provinces and small towns are dying. They need people.
Yeah.
Where are we going with this issue? I'm a Generation X. I was born in 1972, so I'm an old guy now. But baby boomers, my parents' generation, we're all going to go one day. Who's going to take over our jobs? And we can't expect demographics to solve that problem because we're not producing enough babies in our country. We're not replacing our population. That's why we have immigration. The question then remains, if we have more of a reproductive rate in this country that replaces our population, we have enough babies, then we can be satisfied with the fact that we can replace our population. We're aging, we're getting older, we're being replaced in jobs and whatnot. So migrants serve a very critical role here. My parents came from Pakistan in 1967, and they came at a time when only the educated immigrants were allowed in Canada. And my dad came to Calgary because he was a geologist. They needed geologists back then, and there was a very open immigration pathway for university graduated migrants. But the challenging issue, as Rachel demonstrated with human rights, is that in the 70s, a lot of refugees came from different countries. Idi Amin kicked out the Ismailis from Uganda. Okay, that's why a lot of them ended up here. Okay, there are many migration movements because of political issues, but look at the Ismaili population today in Canada. Our former mayor, Nahid Nenshi, was a mayor of Calgary. He's Ismaili. Okay. There are many businesses run in Alberta, in Calgary, and all across Canada from migrants from different parts of the world and different countries. When you look at the larger economic impact, and you have to discuss economics to the government because that's really what they want to hear. But what is discussed here is even more important. And I totally agree with Rachel that we need to introduce that ethical human dimension to law. We tend to treat people in the law as kind of numbers sometimes, like quotas and things like that, not recognizing the impacts on families, on children, and their families. Canada is an open, receptive country. People have changed their life, and we have made beautiful lives out of people's arrival in this country, and they have influenced us. I always kind of joke around with people, but I'm serious, that if you get rid of immigration, which restaurant are you going to eat at? Okay. I'm all about food. So if I go to an Indonesian restaurant, an Uzbeki restaurant, okay, a South African restaurant, I met a couple of people the other day from Paraguay, okay. Have a Paraguayan restaurant, okay. Eat some good food and have some good times, okay. This is how we bond. Those businesses will enrich Canada more than anything else. And when you look at our laws, even IRPA, Immigration Refugee Protection Act, there are certain, in the preamble, there are certain objectives listed as to why Canada is doing what it's doing. One of them is not only to foster multiculturalism, but to, create a diverse society so that we can get along. That's the whole point. And I think there's a lot of benefits to immigration because of that. There's a lot of issues we have to work on too. Absolutely. And I'll be the first person to attack those issues. But the anti-immigrant sentiment is dangerous for not only Canada, but for the whole world, because ignorance is reigning supreme here. And we should never allow that to happen.
Well, there's a good example of that. Again, I'm talking of Nova Scotia. Look at the family that came to Antigonish from Syria, right? And they really enriched that part of the country and with their Peace by Chocolate. Who doesn't?
Exactly. And that's what makes Canada great. You go anywhere in this world with a Canadian passport.
A real ambassador for Canada.
Yeah. I carry the Canadian passport with pride, knowing that I come from a family of immigrants. I was born in Calgary, but I'm so proud to carry that Canadian passport. I'm not a nationalist. I'm someone who's proud of his country because we have so much respect in the world for the way we treat migrants.
Yeah.
And we're kind of, sometimes we get off track and there are issues like that, but we're destroying our own reputation for being an open, receptive society that gives us strength. not weakness. And our attitudes, our Canadian attitudes are such that we are still respected in the world. And it makes a big difference for when we travel. When we travel, we become migrants too. But how are the people in Australia going to treat us, or China or India, wherever you're going? They love Canadians because of our values with respect to being tolerant. Yeah. And I think we're moving away from that a little bit. It's not a lost cause. It's something that we can bring back. That's something we have to think in the larger scheme of things. Even if we're focusing on climate change or climate migration, these are very specific topics. There's so much more you can talk about, but that's what makes Canada a very respectable nation. And I think there are great opportunities to pursue in that direction.
Beautifully said. Thank you again, Professor Zaidi. And yeah, despite it not looking like that to us, sometimes human rights practitioners in Canada does have a good reputation around the world. That you're right to point out we're beginning to, and I think there was this recent survey that ranked Canada and Switzerland as the top two countries with best reputation around the world, which is again surprising if you're living here and your business is to criticize the government. I also realized that I didn't leave you all with the direct link to the report that we celebrated today. So apologies for that coming late, but it is now in the chat. Thank you again for spending a part of your evening with us. I truly hope and wish we had more time, but it is good to know that we had such a lively and lovely discussion this evening. And if this was useful to you, please, again, feel free to subscribe to CPJ's monthly newsletter to stay connected. And I'll repeat my heartfelt pitch. Any donation, no matter the size, makes you a CPJ member for an entire year. Membership isn't just a label. It empowers us to do this work of public engagement and to meet with decision makers here in Ottawa and say that there is a growing list of constituents from coast to coast to coast who care enough to support climate justice, refugee and migrant rights, and poverty eradication with their own dollars. And if they take it seriously enough to do that, we think that policymakers should do that too. So once again, thanks again for your time tonight. Take care and have a great night. Bye-bye.
Go Jays, go.
Are you?
Go Jays, go.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rachel.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.